Lost Ark, Berserker Guide. What's up, Saviors? GH here. Berserker Mayhem Guide, engravings, stats, specialty explanation. How do you actually use your skills? What are your skills? Your gems, your runes, your cards, all that in this video. This build focuses on boss fights but also works for mobbing. And with that said, let's not waste any more time. Let's do this. Let's start with what is a Berserker. It's a melee DPS class with a decent selection of stagger skills, weak point skills, and he can self-buff. You have a lot of self-buff that increases your crit rate, and you can also increase the damage taken by enemies because some of your main skills can debuff enemies with damage amplification, which increases damage taken of enemies by 6%. Damage amplification is important, guys, because it also increases the damage of your teammates. Now, Berserker's specialty is called Burst, and it increases his damage output. This one over here, that is the Berserker Burst meter, or what the game call Fury meter. It will fill up as you hit enemies, and when you use it, it will give you a buff called Burst, and it increases your movement speed by 20%, attack speed by 20%, and crit rate by 30%. Now, when you're on burst mode, it will slowly deplete and return you to normal state and give you an exhaustion buff for 30 seconds. And exhaustion will prevent you from gathering fury or filling up your burst meter. So you're gonna have to wait before you can gather fury so that you can use burst mode again. Now, Berserkers got two class specific engraving, Berserker Technique and Mayhem. Keep in mind, guys, that you cannot use both. They do not stack. So never use Berserker Technique and Mayhem together. Berserker Technique increases your critical damage by 70% at level 3 and removes the exhaustion debuff. This is a much more safer route for Berserkers, but it got a significantly lower damage output than Mayhem. Now, Mayhem instantly fills up your fury, your burst meter, so you can easily use it. And when you use it, it will give you a different burst mode called Dark Burst. And what it does is, your HP will turn to 25% of your maximum HP. You cannot exceed 25% of your maximum HP, it's locked. And all the healing you receive will be 40% of what it can give. And the shielding you get is only 25% of what it could do. And in exchange for all those dangerous, risky things, you get outgoing damage by 60%, attack speed and movement speed by 15%, and reduced damage taken by 65%. And there's another thing about Mayhem. When you disable Mayhem, you will heal by 25% of your maximum HP. So this is a decent self-heal. But in exchange for disabling Dark Burst mode, you will get a debuff called Dark Binding for 30 seconds, and it will prevent you from going burst mode for 30 seconds. So make sure you need the heals when you disable Dark Burst mode. And now that we're talking about engravings, here is the engravings that you should use. First is Mayhem. This is the centerpiece of this build. You must have this. Second is Keen Blunt Weapon. This will increase your critical damage. Third is Master's Tenacity. This will increase your outgoing damage by 16% if your HP is lower than 50%, which is gonna be easy for this build because of Mayhem. Those are your 3 mandatory engravings. Focus on getting those. After those, you can try to use Raid Captain, which basically gives you more outgoing damage the faster you run. The more movement speed you have, the more outgoing damage you get. And keep in mind, guys, that we have a 40% bonus movement speed cap, and 45% of 40% is 18%. So, if you can max your movement speed, you can get plus 18% more outgoing damage. Most probably, you will have around 25% bonus movement speed if you have the Mayhem buff, and 45% of 25% is 11.25% more outgoing damage. And keep in mind, guys, that there are movement speed buffer classes and movement speed buffs in the game. You can also use Curse Doll, which will increase your attack power but will lessen your healing. Or you can use Grudge to get more damage, but you will also receive more damage. So think about it. This is a risky proposition, but it will get you the most damage increase out of all of the engravings, but you need combat experience for this. Last engraving you can try, and this is only for new players still learning the game. I must repeat, this is for newer players still learning the Berserker class. And I'm talking about Heavy armor. At level 3, it will give you 100% to all defense, and it will make you tougher and less likely to die on regular attacks. Now stats, you're gonna be crit rate here with swiftness on your necklace. So mainly crit rate, then swiftness. Put all your stats in crit rate, then the rest is swiftness. We are crit rate here because by default, we have low crit rate on Mayhem, and focusing on crit will result in higher damage output. You can try a balanced approach on crit rate and swiftness, just make sure that it doesn't affect your crit rate that much. Now that we're done with the engravings and stats, now skills. I will do this as fast as I could and as clearly as I could. And if you have any questions, let's just discuss it on the comments. Here is my skill setup, guys. We're gonna start from the top and we're only gonna discuss the important skills. First skill is Finish Strike. This is one of your main damaging skills. You take this for more damage against enemies, mainly bosses. This is also good for stagger and weak point. Now you take Overwhelm here for the rune, and the skill 3 augment is Enhanced Strike for damage, weak point detection for boss damage, and Lights Out for, again, more damage. Next skill is Shoulder Charge. This is optional. You can choose not to take this. It's your mobility skill, or depending on your augments, it can also be your only source of self-shielding. Next skill is Tempest Slash. It's like Finish Strike. It's also one of your main source of damage, and it's also good for stagger and weak point. You take the Overwhelm rune here. Or if you so choose to take advantage of Conviction and Judgment rune, you can use either one here. Just make sure your Conviction and Judgment is of high rarity. If you're not familiar with Conviction and Judgment rune, Conviction will give you a chance to receive a buff that does nothing but get consumed by the Judgment rune. And if you successfully consume the Conviction buff and activated the Judgment buff, you get mana recovery buff and reduce cooldown by 15% for 5 seconds. So if you use the Conviction rune, you must also have another skill with the Judgment rune. Okay, now for the skill 3 augment of Tempest Slash. At level 4, it's Quick Prep for cooldown, then Weak Point Detection for boss damage, and Driving Hit for damage. Next skill is optional and it's Mountain Crash. It's your counter attack and damage amplification debuff skill. This is only at level 4 to take the damage amplification. Next skill is Hellblade. This is your strongest damaging skill with high amounts of stagger. You need the Galewind rune for this skill. Or if you so choose to take advantage of Conviction and Judgment, you can use either one here. Just make sure your Conviction and Judgment is of high rarity. And for the skill 3 augments of Hellblade, at level 4 it's Leap, at level 7 it's Deadly Blow, and at level 10 it's Earth Flip for overall damage increase. Next skill is optional and it's Chain Sword. It's your counter and self-buffing skill. Because with the proper skill 3 augments, you can give yourself a 3-second crit rate buff and attack speed buff. The problem with this skill is it's also your counter skill. And counter skills should be reserved for the occasion. So you either just level 1 this and keep it for counters, or do what I did and use it all the time for the self buffs. And if I really need to counter an enemy, I'll just use Mountain Crash. You can use Rage or Galewind rune here. As for the skill 3 augments, it's Vital Point Hit for the crit rate buff, then Swift Attack Prep for the attack speed buff, then Quick Prep so that you can use it much more frequently. You can take away points from this if you don't have enough skill points. Next skill is another optional skill and it's Maelstrom. This is like Chain Sword, but it gives better crit rate buff and it lasts 1 second longer. And by the way guys, Chain Sword crit rate buff and Maelstrom crit rate buff doesn't stack. If you're gonna use Maelstrom, use Galewind here. As for the skill 3 augments of Maelstrom, it's Nimble Movement at level 4 and Vital Point Hit at level 7. You don't need to level 10 this because this is a weak skill and it's only used for the buffs. Next skill is Strike Wave. This is another hard hitting skill with high stagger. You should use Galewind here. And as for the skill 3 augment, it's Quick Prep, Limit Break, and Earth Flip for increased damage output. Now, next skill is Red Dust. It's your main skill. You always use this one because this increases your attack power by 24% for 6 seconds, but you must hit an enemy or else it doesn't buff you. You can further improve its buff by picking Damage Amplification at level 4. You use this for the damage increase debuff. Now at level 7, it's Vital Point Hit so that you get a 6-second crit rate buff. And at level 10, you pick Red Shock because it will be an AoE around you. As for the rune, use Rage for a chance to get more buffs. Next skill is Sword Storm. It does a decent amount of damage and it's AoE with mid to high stagger, and the skill 3 augment are Vital Point Hit for more crit, Weak Point Detection for increased damage against bosses, and Flame Storm for more damage. Last skill is Dark Rush. You can't really change anything here. This is a decent DPS skill with a very high stagger. Use a cooldown gem for this. And as for the gems, get both cooldown and damage gems for Hellblade and Strike Wave. The rest is cooldown gems. As for the Awakening, both Awakening skill is good. Chain of Vengeance is for AoE or Chaos Dungeons, and Berserk Fury is more for single target. Here's my skill setup, guys. I usually change Maelstrom here for something else, like if I need counter, I replace it with Mountain Crash, or if I need mobility or shield, I replace it with Shoulder Charge. Now, skill usage. In general, always start with Red Dust. Like, if you want to use your Awakening skill, you must use Red Dust first for the buffs, then use your Awakening skill. Now, for your normal skills, start with Red Dust first, then follow it with your strongest skill, Hellblade, then Tempest Slash for a quick last hit. The Red Dust buffs will be over after Tempest Slash. After that, your next skill buffs is Maelstrom or Chain Slash depending on what you decided to get. So just use Maelstrom or Chain Slash, then use another DPS skill. Always start with the skill buffs like Red Dust, Chain Slash, or Maelstrom. As for the cards, early on the game, use damage reduction cards like Nature's Elementals or the Will Meet Again set. And when you're in the end game, try using Lost Wind Glyph or even better, Light of Salvation. Guys, if you wanna see a Glaivier guide, there it goes on the screen. And there goes a Paladin guide. Leave a like, guys, before you go. And this is Gaming Hardcore. See you in the next one.